My comic shop closed over a decade ago, but if there's one place where I feel that same sense of camaraderie, it's Fat Moose Comics, New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store, led by current owner Sean Hendricks. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany, New Jersey, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. Step into the refraction with Drunken Avenger #1, The Volunteer, an indie comic by Rick Reason that turns the tropes upside down. 4 men died in 9 seconds. John Stevens survived, but survival has a price. Now, the government calls him a variable. The media calls him the Drunken Avenger, and the city of Meridian is caught in the crossfire between civil liberty and national security. Follow @Drunken Avenger on social media for project updates and previews. I'm a parent, which means that a family-friendly comic shop is a must, and there's none better than Aw Yeah Comics. Visit one of their 3 locations, Harrison, New York, Muncie, Indiana, or Skokie, Illinois, home to our pal, Sweet Sweet Bernie. Follow them on social media and at awyeahcomics.com for news about signings, live sales, and much more. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Say it with me now. Aw yeah. I talk about Smallville a lot, but when it comes to listening, one podcast is at the top of my queue. Always Hold On to Smallville, hosted by our pal, Zach Moore. Zach and his guests bring tremendous insight, passion, and humor to each and every episode. And while their series rewatch has concluded, the podcast continues with more great Smallville and Superman talk. Listen wherever you get podcasts, and keep an eye out for the other shows on the Always Hold On To network. Welcome to Lighting the Bat Signal, a Batman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss the 2005 film Batman Begins, directed by Christopher Nolan and starring Christian Bale, is one of the hosts of the All-Star Superfan podcast, Rob O'Connor. Ready to go spelunking?
The way I see it, Anthony, all this stuff belongs to you anyway, so it's yours to use as you see fit.
Very good, very good. I am so excited to do this episode. Honored to have you here. At some point in the future of this podcast, I will inevitably do an episode in which I rank all of the Batman movies. And when that time comes, spoiler alert, Batman Begins will be #1. It remains my favorite of all the films, as much as I've enjoyed all of them to varying degrees. And certainly within Nolan's trilogy, we know The Dark Knight looms very large, deservedly so. I think The Dark Knight Rises doesn't always get the love it deserves. But for me, personally, in terms of how formative it was for me and how it cemented my Batman fandom at a critical point, Batman Begins continues to tower above the rest. Where does it fall within your Batman film hierarchy?
Yeah, so I will echo everything you've said. I don't even know if you know this. I have a Nolan Batman tattoo inked across the back of my shoulders. And I got it on the 10-year anniversary of Batman Begins because this film in particular meant so much to me as a Batman fan. I will say with the years that have passed and everything else, I think it reluctantly occupies a #2 spot behind Batman 89, but there are days, and today might be one of them, where it is right back there in the #1 spot. I remember we were asked what our favorite movie of all time was in high school, and I said Batman Begins, and it was only 2 years after it came out. I cannot tell you how hyped I was for this film leading up to it, and how excited I was, because I'd grown up with all the other Batman films. I loved them all, but I fully acknowledged that there was room for a film that really dove deep into Batman himself and into his psyche, his origin, what drove him. I think Batman Forever especially and Batman 89 really scratched the surface in that sense, but we really needed a full-fledged Batman Year One type film. And I was so excited for it, and everyone was kind of saying, it's never going to live up to your expectations. Incorrect. It blew my expectations out of the water. This was the first time watching any film at all where I was kind of like, I can't believe how good this is. This is beyond my wildest dreams how good it is, and it changed everything as far as I'm concerned. And I still think it's almost flawless. There's little problems with it, little flaws in the diamond. I think Christopher Nolan, as wonderful as he is, I think there are kind of glaring errors in all of his films. But it's wonderful to talk about. I would take the massive flaws in a Christopher Nolan film over the kind of humdrum flaws in, an MCU movie any day of the week.
Yeah, man, I echo all of that. And I know I talked about this when we did our series premiere, but this hit me at age 18 in 2005, and I had just graduated high school. So this was the summer between high school and college. And I just remember going to see the film at the theater in Yonkers, New York, that is now our Alamo Draft House. It was a different theater at the time. And I went with my crew of buddies from high school, and that was a regular outing for us to go to the movies. Mm-hmm. And I just remember sitting there during the movie and then standing around in a circle outside afterwards talking about it. And the predominant memory and feeling was just, wow, like that was beyond what I expected it to be or that I thought it could be. And not to sound ancient, but it was a different time for movies and especially superhero movies. And I guess that takes a number of forms, but one aspect of that is I just don't have a memory of going in knowing all that much about the film. And I think that's a big part of the reason why it blew me away the way that it did. I mean, certainly I had seen at least a trailer, and to whatever extent Wizard Magazine had covered it, I would have read those articles and interviews and seen those photos. So it's not like I went in completely cold, but at the same time, I think about where we are now as we're approaching the Supergirl movie and the Batman Part 2 and all of these other films. And between the various trailers and promotional clips and leaked set photos and interviews and social media, I just feel like we know so much more. And there was something really beautiful and pure about that kind of experience that I got to have as that 18-year-old kid.
I will say, I understand where you're coming from. I will say, I had just started to be online in the run-up to this, and I specifically remember the promotional photos they put out of Christian Bale as Bruce Wayne, and especially Gary Oldman as Jim Gordon. I remember when that photo hit, everyone was like, oh, it's like he walked off the pages of the comics. Amazing. And I specifically remember there was kind of like a pencil drawing concept art image of what the Batsuit was going to be like. And I remember a lot of people being disappointed because they were kind of like, oh, well, this kind of looks like it could have been in one of the other movies because it's all black, and then it has the gold belt and the bat kind of the full bat across his chest. It kind of just looks like a cross between, Batman Returns and Batman Forever-ish. Like I think a lot of people were hoping for something more comics accurate with the gray suit and all that. So I remember people being disappointed about that, but then the full image of him in kind of immersed in the shadows came out. Everyone was very excited about that. And I do remember bits and pieces, actually, now that you say it. Like, I remember in Empire magazine, I think it might have been Charles Roven or something talking about how every aspect of the film was going to be realistic, and they were really trying to show how something like this could happen in the quote-unquote real world. And the one thing that stuck with me was, like, everything is real, from the car to the gadgets to the plane. And I remember coming out of the movie going, wait a second, wasn't there supposed to be a Batplane in this? So I don't know, did they plan that at some stage and then did they dump it? But I don't think it was quite the same level as now, where literally James Gunn is tweeting everything about the movie before it comes out, which I think is just ridiculous and a step far too far. And I like James Gunn, I like that movie and all that, but, put the phone down, James Gunn. Whereas Nolan is so, even now, he's just radio silence, which I think a director should be in a lot of ways,
Yeah, and by the way, I don't want to make it sound like 21 years ago was the dark ages, but yeah, no. I couldn't help but have that thought, and especially in contrast to the experience these days. On the note of Nolan himself, these days, he's in a rare club of directors who's a celebrity in and of himself. You have people who go to see the film because it's a Christopher Nolan film, just as they go to see a Quentin Tarantino film or a Ryan Coogler film now. I love that we've seen him join this club as well. But 21 years ago, he was still an up-and-comer, fair to say. And I wanted to ask you, What, if anything, was your experience with Christopher Nolan as a director when this hit? Because this was only his third feature-length film after Memento and Insomnia.
So I think when the announcement was made, I definitely hadn't seen anything by him. But I think in between the announcement and the film coming out, I definitely saw Insomnia with Robin Williams and Al Pacino.
Yeah.
I barely remember anything about it, but I do feel like stylistically it was very different from the kind of Nolan trademarks we'd become used to later on, especially with this film. So that was really the only thing. I've still haven't seen Memento, I'm ashamed to say. I've seen, I've never seen Tenet, actually, the one that came out during lockdown. I think I was a little bit peeved at Nolan, the way he was kind of thumbing his nose at, you know, how cinemas should reopen and all this kind of stuff. And I was going, well, no, maybe they shouldn't, Christopher Nolan. So I never saw that one, but I've seen everything else, and he certainly, by now, he's one of my favorite directors. Yeah, but yeah, what a coup for him to get at this point of his career. It was just insane. Like, what did they see in him at the time that they decided to hand him the keys to the kingdom? You know?
Yeah, it's amazing, and certainly we know after the critical and commercial disappointment of Batman and Robin, that franchise had stalled out. They had canceled plans for a fifth film, and then you had a few years where they were trying to get a new iteration off the ground. Shout out, I suppose, to the short-lived television series Birds of Prey on the WB, because it hit in 2002 during this weird nebulous period between the two film franchises. And for a short period, for those 13 episodes, carried the ball for a little while. I mentioned this previously. I always have a soft spot for that show, and we'll talk about it down the line. But yeah, as far as the films, we had this gap. And with respect to Nolan, I had seen Insomnia in theaters with my parents. Like I remember going to see it, not because it was a Christopher Nolan film. I didn't know him really at all at that point. So I did see his first two films out of order, because if memory serves, I saw Insomnia first and then went back and watched Memento. And I have to give a shout out to my best buddy from high school, Brian, because he and I, in the later years of high school, we would do what we called events. We would just watch movies, but we we call them events. And we would try to pick a director and go through their filmography or films that were thematically related in some way. And I remember watching Memento and really kind of being blown away. You talk about following a non-linear narrative. I mean, that's essentially a movie in reverse. It's really fascinating. And Nolan's first feature-length film. He had done a couple of shorts, and I think he did a movie that was just over an hour long. But as far as a full-fledged feature-length movie, Memento is it. And so I definitely had a frame of reference for this filmmaker, but still it was really early on. And also shout out to my buddy, because he was the one who turned me on to the movie Equilibrium with Christian Bale.
Oh yeah, the kind of Matrix ripoff.
Yeah. But one of his earlier roles, obviously he'd done other stuff as well, including very notably American Psycho. But I remember, I think between Memento and Equilibrium, the pieces were kind of coming into focus for me of some of the folks who were involved with this. And of course, I know a lot was said about it at the time, but Bale had done this movie, The Machinist, right before, where he had lost an absurd amount of weight and was gaunt, as putting it lightly. And then of course had to bulk back up really quickly, probably unhealthily for this. But I remember watching that as well. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So, that's kind of where I was, I guess, as a movie lover. And then as a Batman fan, and I've talked about this, like at this point in time, certainly it had the experience with the earlier films and Batman the Animated Series, and comic book wise, started with No Man's Land, which was 99. So by this point in 2005, I mean, I've been reading the Batman books for half a decade. So like I was primed for this and had the best time in the theater, and I've enjoyed it immensely every time I've rewatched it. I mean, not to be hyperbolic, but this might have been the most I've ever enjoyed it. Like I continue to enjoy it more each time I come back to it. It holds up amazingly well. And we'll get into a lot of the specifics, and I have some fun patron comments and questions, and I'm so excited to pick your brain about all of this. I had a few kind of big picture topics or ideas that I wanted to talk about.
Can I just go back to one small thing you mentioned there? Obviously, Batman and Robin had come out in 1997, and this was 7 years later. In that time, yes, we had the new Batman Adventures. That didn't last very long. And then we had Batman Beyond, which I was always very fond of, but was not the cultural leviathan the Batman the Animated Series was. So you have to remember, I was 15 when this came out. I was 7 when Batman and Robin came out. So for me, there was a pretty substantial fallow period where Batman was not cool, was not the topic of conversation. It was a thing that kids had really grown out of, because the last film they saw was very kiddie oriented, and they kind of painted the whole thing with that brush. And then Adam West would be repeated on TV, and everybody kind of just looked at Batman as those things, this just really loud, colorful, kiddie thing that you grew out of. Meanwhile, here was me reading comics and playing with my toys from the animated series, going, no, guys, there's so much more to this. Trust me on this. And nobody would believe me. So I was like, when this film, when the hype started building for this, I was like, this'll show them, you know? And all my friends who came with me, you know, they'd seen X-Men, they'd seen Spider-Man. They were kind of going, okay, well, let's hear Rob out on this. But they truly didn't believe me until we were leaving the cinema and they were going, oh God, Rob, you are right. Batman is so cool. And, you know, it's just interesting to think about, because now, you know, 5 years will pass and it means nothing because we're old men now. But when you're a kid, that's a lifetime, 7 years, you know? So.
Yeah, no, man, your point is well taken. And I guess one last thing from my perspective on where this hit is, obviously we had the Blade trilogy, which was maybe the first of the dominoes to start to fall here. And we had the start of the X-Men franchise and the Spider-Man franchise. So things were cooking here, but still it was so early in what would become this wave of superhero films. And it was early enough where, I think you didn't exactly know what you were going to get, or whether you were going to get a movie, or whether it was going to spawn sequels or anything else beyond that. So yeah, I feel like this really struck like lightning, you know, clearly for us personally, but in the larger fandom as well.
And just to echo a word you said there, Spawn, Blade, and definitely the Daredevil film from 2003. There is a world where Batman Begins was just kind of like those, you know? And like, as much as I love David Goyer's script, you know, a lot of David Goyer scripts have been handed to directors who aren't Christopher Nolan, and they've turned into films that are not beloved, you know? And I think there definitely is a world where it was more akin to the Daredevil movie, with the ridiculous soundtrack, the ridiculous wire work, and the, you know, overblown acting and all that kind of stuff. There is a world where this film didn't work, and I just thank God that it did, you know, that kind of way.
No, absolutely. So one of the big picture things that I was thinking about is Batman Begins, of course, is an origin story, but what does that mean? You know, I think it's become a bit of a joke at this point, how many times we have seen the Waynes murdered on screen. So much so, I know there are compilations, there are supercuts out there, and when I went to see Batman v Superman in 2016 at our Alamo Drafthouse, they do this pre-show reel where they will show clips that are related to what you're about to see. And one of the things they showed was a compilation of all of the times Thomas and Martha Wayne have been murdered on screen. And so we're all sitting there as we're ordering our food and settling in and whatnot. And, you know, people are chuckling. And then how does BVS open? With the Waynes being murdered in the opening credits. I am a fan of that movie, by the way, but it was just one of those things where we have seen this so many times. Certainly the murder of the Waynes, an essential ingredient of the origin story, but not the entire origin story. And I think that's why, at the most fundamental level, why I keep coming back to Batman Begins, because yes, we have that moment in the alley there with Bruce sitting by the bodies of his slain parents. But how does he go from that boy in that alley to Batman? The training, the quest, the development of the gear, developing these tactics. That's the full origin story. And that's what you don't often get to see. I'm not saying you never see it, but a lot of times it is boiled down to that murder. And like we said, if you're only going to be able to show one part of it, yes, I understand why that would be the part. But for a movie like this, to actually follow Bruce's journey, and like you were saying before, really drill down on the man, the person behind this, and show how he becomes, as Ducard says, a legend. That's what I think always sets it apart, and what was so revelatory for me to see at that formative step.
100%. I will actually make a controversial statement here in that I actually think it improves that part of the legend, because so many versions of Batman's origin, when we do hear them, it's his parents died. In that moment, Bruce Wayne dies too, and he immediately is Batman, and he uses his wealth and influence to travel the world and get all the training he needs, and then he comes back and he's Batman, done. In this, that's very much not the case. He doesn't really know what to do with himself for most of his youth. It's kind of implied that he goes to college. It doesn't really go very well for him there. And then he kind of just stumbles around the world, getting into trouble, getting into fights, not really sure what to make of himself, except that he knows he hates injustice. And then he kind of falls in with the League of Shadows. He finds this surrogate father in who he thinks is Ducard. And then that sort of sets him on the path to realizing this crucial truth about himself, is that he doesn't want to kill anyone. He wants to bring an end to injustice, but because of what, and that's another thing, because of what happened to Joe Chill in this film, which is radically different from the source material, and a lot of people really don't like that about the film. Joe Chill actually gets killed in this movie, and there's no way for Bruce to have any sort of revenge against him. Because of that, he knows that vengeance is meaningless and that the true justice must be achieved another way. I love all that stuff, and I think it's kind of missing from a lot of versions of Batman. And the other thing we hear time and time again, and I think there's merit to this debate, by the way, we hear time and time again that, well, Batman's just this rich guy and he's really, really wealthy, and a guy with that much wealth, so what? Whereas in this movie, he's kind of stripped of his wealth, and definitely in the novelization, which we'll talk about later on, they really hammer home the fact that his wealth really doesn't get him in with the League of Shadows at all. And there's plenty of times where he could die and he has no way of phoning home to get Alfred to help him or anything like that. Like, he's very much, he becomes Batman in spite of his wealth in this story, I believe. And I really, really like that aspect, that, he could be the richest guy in the world and it still wouldn't make him capable of the kind of demands that he's put up against with the League of Shadows. And we see that again throughout the movie. We'll talk about it as it comes up. But I really like that in so many ways, Nolan's Batman really democratizes Batman. It's not just that he's a rich guy. It's his sheer force of will that kind of harnesses this legend.
I agree. I think the fact that he has this period of floundering, of really not knowing which direction to go in, you can still trace his journey back to that night in the alley. So I think the core is intact, but the fact that it takes a while to figure out the actual means to achieve this, I think is really critical. And that's the journey that this film takes us on. And I think I talked about this last episode when we were discussing No Man's Land, about how there was a comic book story where Bruce had failed and actually abandoned the city and needed to rediscover his purpose. Things had fallen apart to such a degree. And that, I think, was so important for me as an early reader to see that fallibility, because like we know, I think one of the criticisms of the character a lot of times is this Bat God idea. And it's like, I never subscribed to that because I had that early comic book reading experience. Well, similarly, you look at him in this, and this was one of the other big picture things that I had in my mind as I was watching it and thinking about it, is the character's fallibility, literally and figuratively. And so in the first act, as we all know, we do have this nonlinear structure where we're cutting back and forth between young Bruce. We see the murder of his parents. We see him as a young adult returning for the hearing where Joe Chill is going to be released, all of that. And we're intercutting with Bruce on this journey that will take him to the League of Shadows and then ultimately back to Gotham. But we open with young Bruce and Rachel running across the fields of the mansion, and Bruce hiding and falling into the well, into that well, and then being surprised and scared.
The man who falls, you might even say.
The man who falls.
Come back to
that. Right here, let's stay on it, because like I always say with these podcasts, it is a journey and I'm always learning something new. And certainly for all of these years, I was, well aware of the influence of Batman Year One on this story, especially the Gordon piece of it and the depiction of Gotham City and its corruption. The Long Halloween, Flash. The Long Halloween, we know certainly was an influence as well. But I'll admit, I was not aware of the short story, The Man Who Falls. And I came across it as I was doing my research here. And I did have this moment very arrogantly where I'm like, that must be a mistake. They must mean The Man Who Laughs, the Ed Brubaker story, even though that was a Joker story and it wouldn't quite line up, but it was set in the early days. And then I looked it up. And it was this 16-page short story by Denny O'Neil and Dick Giordano. And it first appeared as the only original story in a trade paperback collection of the late 80s series Secret Origins. So they did this trade paperback collection and they had this new short story. It was then later reprinted in the Batman Begins trade paperback that included the comic book adaptation. There was a Greg Rucka story and an Ed Brubaker story, and they included this. So all these years later, this was the first time that I really discovered The Man Who Falls and actually read it. And what I was so struck by is, it came out in 89 and it does synthesize aspects of Year One and Blind Justice and Shaman. But the piece of it that so jumped out at me was that scene in the comic of Bruce falling into that well and being scared by the bats. And I'm glad that I finally have that connective tissue to see what Nolan was drawing from, because that's one of the other big picture things about this movie is the way it delves into this theme of fear and really makes it a very cohesive through line across Bruce's story. Because when you look at the origin stories, and I even went back, I looked at Detective Comics 33, which I believe was the earliest iteration of kind of seeing the backstory of this. And there, very bare bones, but you get those essential ingredients of his parents being murdered and Bruce developing himself to his scientific and physical development. And then a bat flies through the window and he's Batman. And that whole idea of a bat either flying through a window or crashing through a window has become an indelible part of the origin story. Miller did it in Year One. Morrison would go back to that moment. We've seen that play out a lot of times, and it's effective. And there's something very primal about that bat striking at that moment and inspiring Bruce to adopt it as his symbol. And there are times where we will get a line about how, I was terrified by bats as a child. It's a different story when you see it. And what Nolan is able to do in this movie here is start with this moment of fear that Bruce experiences in that well. Then we carry it through to the night at the opera. They're not seeing the Zorro movie. They're at the opera. And Bruce is scared by those performers on the stage who remind him of the bats he was terrified by. And that's what prompts them to leave. So I feel like connecting the fear of the bats, right? Drawing that line from the moment in the well to the moment in the theater that led to the death of his parents, to ultimately conquering that fear and turning it back on the criminals. It just, I love the way this all tied together.
100%. And just to say a nice thing about Dark Knight Rises as well, that they come back to that theme of fear, where the lesson he needs to learn there is that he needs to find his fear again, because his fear gives him focus. Like he's not a man without fear. He's not Daredevil. Like he treats fear as this thing that there's a balance to how much fear he needs and how much he needs to overcome it and how much he needs to turn it against people. And I think, to maybe trolley onto something else, like the life lessons in this are incredibly positive, modern masculinity lessons for a young teenage boy to learn. That there's another thing that Ducard says: your anger gives you great strength, but if you let it, it will destroy you. That's a great thing to learn when you're a kid. And that actually harkens back to Man Who Falls as well, because there's a moment where Master Karigi says to Bruce, some great violence has marked you. It gives your genius for combat technique. Unless you are very lucky, it will destroy you. Like, so that there's a couple of really key lines in the dialogue that harken back to that. But definitely, no, everything about the fear in this, and Thomas Wayne telling Bruce not to be afraid, is just such a powerful, kind-hearted, tender moment. And I love the way, like, I really appreciate in these newer Batman movies, in both the Joaquin Phoenix Joker and the Pattinson movie, how, Thomas Wayne is maybe a little bit sketchier of a guy. I think we've earned the right to maybe broaden it out and do it that way now. But I really love going back to this film and seeing just what a beacon of light he is in Bruce's life. And maybe that's just the way Bruce remembers him, but it's just such a positive depiction of fatherhood. He's so kind to his son. He shows him love. He shows him kindness. And there's that great moment where they're on the train, and he, minutes after we've even met Thomas Wayne, he's literally preaching about what billionaires should be doing, which is pouring their money into public infrastructure because it makes life better for everybody else. And and even Bruce asking him, "Oh, well, is that where you work, Dad?" He's like, "No, I don't work in the place that makes all the money. I work in the hospital." It's just, it's really, really lovely. The film is full of kind of positive depictions of male role models, even Alfred later on. I'm not going to start crying this early in the podcast, but we all know what I'm going to say. there's so many lovely. I've completely gone off course here, and I think that's going to happen with this movie, Anthony. Apologies.
No, man. Same here. But yeah, that moment on the train where, like you said, Bruce asks, "Is that where you work?" And he's like, "No, I leave the running of the company to better men." And Bruce is like, "Better men?" And he goes, "Well, more interested men." So this is one of the other core takeaways I had, and I've thought and spoken about this previously, but I think as a kid reading and watching Batman stories, you put yourself in Bruce's shoes, or, and you think about like, oh my God, like what a horrific, traumatic experience that would be. And what would that do to you? And that fear of losing your parents, and certainly in such a grisly way. Now, like as a husband, as a father, as a fully grown adult, I watch it from the perspective of Thomas Wayne, at least at that point in the story. And that's the fear of not being able to be there for your child and to not be able to protect them in that moment. And a little bit more to say on that, but I agree with you wholeheartedly that I like here, at least, the fact that we have this rather lovely glowing portrait of the Waynes, more so Thomas. Martha really doesn't have anything to do, which is unfortunate.
No.
At the same time, we really only spend a very brief period with them. And I understand drilling down more so on Thomas, especially if we're kind of staying on this track of the father figures Bruce will gravitate towards elsewhere in the film, namely Ducard and Alfred, certainly, and Lucius. And so he has these father type figures. So I understand why we would focus on that. But I was thinking about that because, I know we have seen more recently, like you said, sketchier iterations of the Waynes. And yeah, I think you put it well. Like maybe we have earned it by this point, and maybe there are stories that are built to explore that. Arguably, especially in terms of what we're seeing in the real world and what we have seen for
100%.
years, the idea of the ultra wealthy not using it for the betterment of the people around them is sadly truer to life. All that being said, there's something really refreshing and optimistic about this view of the Waynes. And yeah, the kindness and patience that Thomas displays when he rescues Bruce from the well, and then he's examining him later and he's showing Bruce the pearls that he's going to give to Martha. That moment on the train, talking about how they use their wealth to help the people, the building of the train, the fact that this was the brainchild of Thomas Wayne. And then of course we'll play into the climax of the movie. I love all of that. It's a very stark contrast to Thomas in The Man Who Falls, who is just berating Bruce. He's like, "You idiot, I told you to stay away from that well." It's like, whoa, I'm glad we didn't go down that track for this movie.
Yeah, like because I read I'm so glad I did, by the way. I read The Man Who Falls like minutes before we started recording here. I had read it loads of times growing up because I had that comic adaptation that came with it at the end there. But yeah, that always stood out to me. Like he's such a hard ass. In the couple of panels where we see him, he's like berating Bruce. And I wonder, is that Denny O'Neil harkening back to The Dark Knight Returns maybe a little bit, where Thomas is kind of like, "Oh, that damn rabbit, he won't stop chasing the rabbit." Like maybe he's extrapolating from that into this really hard ass version. It doesn't really work for me. But to your point about Martha Kent being underserved, if
Martha
and
Wayne.
when they ever do,
You said Martha
Jesus
Kent.
Christ. Sorry. Apologies,
See,
guys.
that's why that moment in BVS works.
Here we go again. No, but that's fertile ground for whenever they do reboot Batman again, is the maternal figures in his life, which we never see in any version. Like, give me a movie version of Leslie Tompkins, especially the version from the animated series. I'd love to see her in a Batman movie, But certainly, I think that's kind of a problem across a lot of Christopher Nolan movies. He doesn't always know how to write women, and when he does, that they're kind of props a little bit. I think Rachel is fairly okay in these movies, but definitely it's an issue there in Inception and maybe to a lesser extent in Oppenheimer as well. But that's neither here nor there.
But yeah, no, fair enough. But I will say the moment where they're at the opera and they're in the seats and Bruce gets scared and he turns to his father and asks to leave, and he just gives that please. And then they go out, and the way Thomas kind of takes the blame with Martha, he's like, "No, it was me. Like, yes. I needed I don't know. It's always resonated with me. And I don't know, like, it just feels like something that I would do with my own son of like, "Yeah, no, it's fine. Like, let's just do this." But so staying on the Thomas track, Thomas is specifically referenced and, well, I guess the idea, the memory of him weaponized against Bruce in two key instances, right? One is where the young adult Bruce Wayne, who just missed out on his opportunity to murder Joe Chill because Joe Chill is murdered by one of Carmine Falcone's agents, goes to confront Falcone in this club and is belittled, dismissed, roughed up by Falcone and his men. And at the end, Falcone is taunting Bruce, talking about how, because he shared a cell with Joe Chill, he's like, yeah, Chill told me about your old man, how he begged for his life, begged like a dog. Obviously, we know that's not the case, but you feel how much that hits Bruce in that moment. Not to get too in the weeds on this, but I always read that. I mean, certainly we know that wasn't the case because we saw the scene, but I always took it as Falcone making up the entire thing. I didn't necessarily get the sense that Joe Chill had depicted events that way, because the Joe Chill we saw at the hearing did seem genuinely repentant. Is that your read on that Falcone scene, that this is just a total fabrication on his part, not Chill's?
I absolutely view it that way. You can see, Joe Chill is being presented as a sympathetic man who is truly sorry for what he did. I'm sorry for it. Not a day goes by that I'm not sorry for what I did. And I think what the film is doing, it's another change, another positive change they've made to the mythos, which is that they're saying this guy who came out of the shadows and shot the Waynes is not the ultimate embodiment of evil. He's just a guy who was down on his luck, and the reason he was down on his luck was because of these larger forces that created this horrible, economic depression that Gotham exists in. And if Batman is real, he needs to be going over after those guys, and not the muggers with, the wife and sick kid or whatever it is, and I really, really love that. And I think that's true across the Nolan trilogy. He's not just beating up these guys on the street. He's going after the guys who are creating the chaos, Now, fair enough, they're still mobsters, he's not going after Lex Luthor or any of that. But I think that is a really noble change. The reason he goes out looking to seek the means to fight injustice is to take down these kind of larger structures that create this horrible version of Gotham that we live in. And through doing that, he discovers that it's an even greater conspiracy, which I think has also aged pretty well, Anthony, because as we know now, not getting into stuff, but that was always one of those things watching the movie. It's it's another secret society and they've been behind all this stuff for generations, whereas now we're kind of going, actually, that kind of tracks.
The Joe Chill question, we hit on this in our premiere episode, and I'm open to the different ways this has been spun. It's like whether or not the murderer is named and caught or sort of represents the evil that's out there. But I think this movie and the way you eloquently encapsulated, I think makes a good argument for why Joe Chill arguably should be named and caught and even dealt with in this way, where that does put an end to the quote unquote vengeance that Bruce can achieve because he's killed by somebody else. And because then it points to, like you're saying, this larger objective, this larger quest. So I really like the way that played. And building off of what you were saying, when Bruce is training with Ducard and Bruce is talking about how he sought to understand the criminal mind, and he talks about the first time he stole to avoid starving. And he says, I lost a lot of assumptions that I had. And so I think that was really an important piece and something that you don't see explored a lot in these stories. So I really love that. And then one other piece with Thomas Wayne in that training sequence on the ice with Ducard, because this whole idea of Bruce's guilt and how he's pushed that down and has really been leaning more into his anger, right? His anger outweighs his guilt at this point, right? As he says. But Ducard talks about how it wasn't your fault that your parents were murdered. It was your father's, right? And an interesting contrast, because we have young Bruce as a kid right after the funeral talking to Alfred and blaming himself. And Alfred's like, no, it was that man and that man alone. Well, here we have another interpretation. We have Ducard saying it wasn't your fault, but he doesn't pin it on the criminal. He pins it on Thomas Wayne. And there's this whole idea about how Thomas failed to act. Ducard is like, what would you have done? And Bruce is like, well, I had training. Yeah. And Ducard's like, well, training doesn't matter. The will to act is everything. Which I don't subscribe to what Ducard is saying there with respect to Thomas himself, but it was just a very interesting idea, I thought, to broach.
I was thinking about this today as well, and I know you'll appreciate this as a Cobra Kai fan. I think the movie is maybe leaving it a little bit open to interpretation a little bit, but I think maybe what Nolan is doing there is you have this lovely, wonderful, kind-hearted father figure in Thomas Wayne, who ultimately does get gunned down, and we find out later on that his efforts to save the city failed, which, and he tried everything. He nearly bankrupted Wayne Enterprises trying to, shake people out of apathy, but it didn't work. And then, eventually he was killed and all that kind of stuff. And then you have Ducard kind of saying, no, you need to be a hard ass. You need to kill the criminals. You need to do all this. And the truth might be somewhere in the middle, I think is maybe the lesson that Bruce takes away from all this, which is similar to what we saw in Cobra Kai. It's like, Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's an apt observation. I think that is kind of ultimately at the heart of where Bruce lands. But yeah, I thought those references to Thomas Wayne and the way that they're kind of thrown in Bruce's face in those couple of instances, was really interesting. And going back to this idea of the fallibility and Bruce falling like in multiple ways. Obviously, we have the fall in the well at the beginning here. And later on, when the mansion is burning and he and Alfred are riding that elevator down and we're following him,
oh man,
his first night out in Gotham before he even has the full bat suit, when he's talking to Gordon and then he makes his escape badly and gets really banged up. Later on, after he has donned the full Batman garb and he's doused with Scarecrow's fear gas and then lit on fire and thrown out of the building. So, we have all of those.
That's instances. A really good observation. I never noticed how many instances there are of him falling. That's really cool.
Yeah. So it's like he makes mistakes. And even going back to what you were saying about how he's really stripped down at the beginning of this. And when he's released from that prison and they literally toss him out of there, he's rolling in the ground on the dirt. It's a down and dirty and grittier version than you see. But those mistakes and those falls, and why do we fall? To learn to pick ourselves up again. Obviously ties in thematically with the movie, but also like I was saying, I mean, I think really once again sort of inoculated me to these complaints that we often hear about Batman, because here I saw a story where he's really struggling to find the way to do this and making mistakes. And I thought that was vitally important to show in this film.
Yeah. It's interesting. It goes back to something we were kind of hinting at earlier on about how, in typically we see Bruce Wayne, the little boy, and he's kind of praying and he makes this vow that he's going to spend his life warring against all criminals. I think is how Bill Finger probably put it, not Bob Kane. But I think typically Batman is presented to us as a child's power fantasy or a child's fantasy of being a hero. Whereas I really think this film positions Batman as more of a teenager's fantasy. And if Spider-Man, the movie, had any influence on this film, it's that. I think this is really a teenager movie rather than a kid's Batman movie. And I think because of that, when you're a teenager, you realize that there are flaws in the world and that you might not have all the answers and that there are things you're going to have to learn and you're going to make mistakes and your mentors are going to make mistakes. They're not going to be these perfect people. So I think that ties in with that. It's learning that, you are going to fall, but why do we fall, So I think it ties in with that a bit.
Yeah, man, absolutely. I think, one of the other big things, and look, over the years of this podcast, we'll of course get into the rest of this trilogy. We're not going to do it right away. We'll take our time getting to all of them. But like I said before, I mean, I do genuinely think Dark Knight Rises doesn't always get the credit it deserves. I personally have always found it a very satisfying conclusion to this Bruce Wayne's arc. And even more so when I go back and I rewatch Batman Begins here, because I think in terms of what is set up, and whenever we talk about the endings of these characters, whether it's Batman or Superman or any of these other iconic superheroes, it's like there are different ways to show what becomes of them. And I think the quote unquote right answer depends on the type of story that you're telling. And I think
set up,
what you see set up here isn't necessarily the idea that he's Batman forever until he drops. I think there's this very clear articulation of this goal here. And we get a beautiful a discussion of this between Bruce and Alfred on the plane about how as a man he can, and of course this echoes what Ducard had told him earlier, but as a man he can be beaten, he can be ignored, but as a symbol, he can be incorruptible, he can be everlasting. Rachel has a line to him at the end of the movie about, maybe when Gotham doesn't need Batman anymore, then they can be together. So I think in a couple of key instances, you do get this idea that, yeah, this is not necessarily meant to be forever, but to be this dramatic example that is going to shake people out of apathy, to become this symbol that can represent something larger. And then hand in hand with all of this, and we see this across the films, certainly, but we see it from the jump here, the realistic physical toll that this would take on someone. I mean, that night after when Bruce wakes up and it's covered in bruises and everything, it's like right from the jump, you see realistically what this would look like for someone. Like it's not tenable for decades. And so I like that the film leaned into that. And so when we do ultimately get to that payoff in The Dark Knight Rises, like that felt appropriate given what is set up here, to me at least.
Yeah, I agree. I always view the Dark Knight trilogy as, what if Batman actually was a real guy? And that this is the movie trilogy that tries to tell the story of the actual guy who existed. And all the other stuff we know about Batman from the comics and the animated series and all, those are like legends that were extrapolated later on. So like if you look at examples like Zorro is based on an actual real life outlaw called Joaquin Murrieta. They named his brother after him in the Antonio Banderas movie. He was just an outlaw who existed for a couple of years and got shot. Like these guys never are actually alive for very long. And so I like that it is a finite period of time during which time he accomplishes certain things. And, and then in this meta universe that they kind of wrote other legends about him that got ridiculous later on. That's the way I always view it. I think one of the things, just to echo what you were saying there about a world without Batman, that he has this finite mission. One of the things that's often said about this trilogy is, oh, well, it's so dark and it's so humorless and it's muted tones. And I couldn't disagree more. Like, this is one of the most hopeful, optimistic, warm versions of Batman we have. And like, this movie really believes in him. It really believes that he's a hero, which, by the way, the Burton movies did not. Like, those are, and I love them for that. Like, they're a very cynical version of Batman. There's that moment in the Batcave with Bruce and Vicky where he's like, oh, well, this is just something I have to do. And she looks at him and she's like, why? It's quiet and tragic. And he kind of has this look on his face like, oh, I don't know why. It's just something I have to do because nobody else can. In this movie, it's like, no, I have to do this because it's the right thing to do. And the movies kind of gradually prove that to be the case for better and for worse, I would say. And yeah, I'm very fond of The Dark Knight Rises. It's clunky as all hell. There's a lot of stuff that needed another go in the oven. But I think, if you read Legends of the Dark Knight, as I'm sure you did in the 90s, like that bit in the pit where he's crawling up the thing and he has to do the jump and all that is right out of like a Legends of the Dark Knight arc,
Yeah.
And that's, I know I'm rambling here. That's another thing people always say about this. Oh, well, it's not really like a Batman comic. It's kind of its own thing. It's just Christopher Nolan doing its own thing. And, the Pattinson movie is way more like the Batman comics, or the Snyder movies are. My God in heaven, guys, please go back and read Denny O'Neil Batman comics from the 70s, or Legends of the Dark Knight from the 90s, or anything written by Frank Miller. The Nolan trilogy is so much like Batman comics. I can't believe it. Like, it's so unfair to say that it's not like Batman comics.
Listen, we're on the same page with this. And as far as the humor, I think that's one of the things that I'm always struck by in rewatching this are those moments that are genuinely funny. I mean,
yeah,
a lot of the business with Bruce and Lucius, and especially when they get to the tumbler, oh, you wouldn't be interested in that. And then, does it come in black? And then the joke later on with the valet about when the car is complimented, he's like, you should see my other one. We have a bunch of these moments.
My favorite little, sorry to cut across, my favorite little joke involving the Batmobile, and it's such a quick little joke. The Batmobile races through a police barrier, and the police are just like scrambling after him. And there's the guy in charge of the barrier, and he just looks down at his coffee cup. It's straight out of like an old Roger Moore James Bond movie. They do that joke like 3 or 4 times in the James Bond movies, and I'll definitely talk about James Bond again before the end of this podcast, but I love that. And does it come in black? So much of Alfred, so much of Alfred's dialogue is just humor. You can take the roles if you like. Just make sure to bring it back with a full tank. Like, how can you say this movie is humorless?
I know.
They're James Bond zingers, you know?
Yeah. And the whole business about adopting a guise to protect those he loves from fear of reprisal. Yeah. And
actually, I was thinking more about myself.
I know. So you're thinking of Rachel. Yeah. No. So that's the thing. Yeah, there are genuinely funny moments. But I think even more than that, I think this movie did a great job of depicting a Bruce Wayne who will forever be haunted by what happened to him in that alley, and is driven in a way that most people, thankfully, can never fully appreciate, yet is still a functioning person. Yes. Yet, and then this is where I think, still is true to the core of the comics. You do still also see here the formation of the Bruce Wayne Playboy persona that Alfred has to kind of nudge him into. And it starts when he wakes up with all those bruises, and it's like, hey, we got to come up with some kind of story here. And I love that whole exchange about like, well, what do rich people like me do? And there's a suggestion of polo. He's like, I'm not learning polo, Alfred. But the fact that you can have a Bruce there who can engage with Alfred, right, in his truest form, as his truest self in the cave there, and can adopt this persona, but then can also have a genuine moment like he has with Rachel at the hotel, where he drops it for a moment, and it's like this, like I am, there is more to me underneath. I am more. So I thought that was very refreshing. I really, really appreciated that. I want to jump back to Zorro for a second. Did it bother you that we didn't have them going to see Zorro in this? Because I was cool with this, and I think Nolan talked about this in an interview where, certainly having the opera performers in those bat-like costumes was really important to trigger Bruce, but also I think the way Nolan put it was that he wanted Bruce's decision to really be kind of an original idea, not to have been inspired by this costumed vigilante that he had seen on screen. Yeah.
I mean, it probably bothered me at the time. I'm not going to lie, because I think I went into this wanting it to just be slavishly faithful to Batman Year One and whatever else. But yeah, the way Nolan put it was he needs to come up with the very concept of a superhero on his own. There can't be anything else he's drawing inspiration from. And then throughout the film, that really tracks, because it's like that they come up with all these reasons for why he has all these various bits and pieces in his arsenal, like. Even the ears on the cowl are like a radio receiver, and the cape obviously has the glider function and all that. If he was just looking at a poster of Douglas Fairbanks going, "Oh yeah, I'll just do that," it would lose the same kind of and obviously then him seeing their Fledermaus and how frightening they are, and the bat motif there just echoing throughout the whole film. I think that works really, really well. I don't really mind that. I think it really solidifies the idea as well that this cannot be a version of Batman where there is also, Superman or Green Lantern or all these, because even in Batman Year One, we get references to Superman and I think possibly Green Lantern as well. So I think that really, really works in this, and it legitimizes this idea, which kind of was traditionally always the case in these live action versions, which is that in these movies that it's just them. There's no other heroes in these universes. And we'll probably never see a version of Batman like that ever again, and I think the last version we'll ever see of Superman like that is probably Superman and Lois, so it's just interesting.
Yeah. I think you're right on that front. The non-linear narrative that the first act follows. Once we get into our second act, where we have Bruce return to Gotham and start to build the bat suit and get out there, then we shift into a more traditional linear narrative. But we do have this back and forth in that first act. I mean, I think this type of device arguably, gets overused sometimes. We see it pop up in various instances. I do generally tend to like it, and I specifically like it here. I thought that the intercutting between younger Bruce, first as a child and then as that young adult who's been kicked out of Princeton, versus the Bruce who's training, I thought that was effective, and there were clearly natural segues and jumping off points that triggered these flashbacks. And of course, it allows us to get to see Christian Bale as Bruce Wayne very early into the film. So I was cool with this. I was curious, though, your take on just sort of that structure, particularly in that first act.
I'm very fond of it. The only thing I'll say is the first time viewing the film, and possibly even the second time, there's the bit where he's sitting by the campfire with Ducard, as we know him at this point in the film. And Ducard mentions it's one of the best scenes of the film. You know, I had a wife, my great love, which she was taken from me. And Bruce said, well, you know, what did you do? And he was like, well, vengeance, Bruce. And Bruce is like, well, vengeance is no good for me. And Ducard is like, well, why? Why can't you have your revenge or something? And then we cut to Bruce arriving at Wayne Manor and talking to Alfred. I think the first time I saw the movie, I thought that was happening in real time, and this was him returning to Wayne Manor.
Gotcha.
And I was kind of confused for a few moments of like, wait, what? So has he left? Like, what's happening here? I wonder, did he make that clear enough that we're flashing back in time, and this is young, 20-something Bruce Wayne coming back from college, And I think I came up with that a little bit the first time, but in every other respect, yeah, I do like the nonlinear thing, and I think it was definitely the right move to not start the movie with the Waynes being killed. That's something that kind of happens later on. I think it's a good 20 minutes into the movie before that happens. I think that was the right thing to do. So yeah, I'm mostly fine with it, except for that moment. I just think maybe they could have hammered that home a little bit more. What I will say though is I am so grateful that it's Christian Bale playing 20-year-old Bruce Wayne and not, Jeff East. Which
dubbed over.
It's such a strange decision in Superman where you just have this completely different actor who's kind of the same age as Christopher Reeve, and you're like, why did they do this when they could have just have him throughout the movie? I think just take the older actor and age him down. Like that's the way we should be doing things.
Yeah, I'm with you. I love the way this plays here. I'm always. It's funny. I don't mean to make it sound like I'm gobsmacked every time I'm watching this movie, but I don't. It's just like I don't know. Every time I watch it, I continue to just be struck by these things, even though kind of analytically, intellectually, I'm aware. But then maybe from that emotional standpoint, I'm like, oh yeah, like the fact that we're plunged right into Bruce waking up in this prison as he's been trying to understand the criminal element, and is challenged to this fight by the quote unquote devil, and he goes, "You're not devil. You're not the devil. You're practice." We get the sense between these that early scene and then the further interactions with Ducard that Bruce, once he leaves Gotham, right, he's abandoned his wealth, all of the trappings, his identity, everything that his status would afford him, and he's stolen, right, to feed himself. He's become part of this little criminal crew that ends up ripping off Wayne Enterprises. So it's like he only goes so far, which I thought was a clever line to draw there. But the idea that he would be participating in crimes to understand the thinking, the fear, the rush that accompanies all of that, I thought that was brilliant, but then perfectly in character that the only one he would quote unquote hurt would be himself because he's only stealing from his own company. And he's in this prison, but he's really, I think Ducard is right that he has gotten lost at this point in trying to find the actual path forward. While we don't see it though, we do get a sense that Bruce has also now trained in different forms of martial arts, because when he is fighting with Ducard, when he arrives at the temple, Ducard is citing the different techniques that he notices Bruce is using. And then I love the line from Ducard. He's like, "This is not a dance." I think that's the headbutt or something like that. So you get the sense that, yes, he has had some training prior to the encounter with Ducard. This is a long-winded way of getting to my question here, which is in comic book tellings of Bruce's odyssey and his training, and even the example that we keep citing, the man who falls, multiple teachers we see Bruce training with. Here in this film, while there is reference to the fact that he has other training, what we really see really focuses on Ducard and the League of Shadows. Do you feel that was effective, or did you bump up against the fact that so much of the training was sort of funneled into this one individual?
Never had a problem with it. What I do always appreciate upon rewatch is it's heavily implied that Bruce is already a master of, well, maybe not a master, but he's very adept in other forms of combat, because we see him in the fight in the prison taking on 6 guys and beats the crap out of them, and they have to put him into solitary to keep those guys safe. So this is already a tough son of a bitch. And then when he's fighting Ducard, as he said, like Ducard is like listing off all the different fighting styles he's using against him. Like Nolan is an awful man for this. Like he'll pepper these things in, and if you're not like listening very, very closely, you'll miss them. But like that was always him hinting that, oh no, this guy already knows a lot of stuff about martial arts. I have to cite the novelization now, Anthony.
Yes.
There's the novelization by Dennis O'Neil, which is just a beautiful piece of symmetry that Denny O'Neil, who wrote The Man Who Falls, also got to write. The novelization for Batman Begins, there is a whole, some of the most substantial original stuff in that novelization is Bruce Wayne stowing away on that boat, on the liner, whatever it is that he's on. And we see him come up against this crew member who doesn't speak any English, and he just starts picking on Bruce, starts beating him up every day that he's on this ship. And little by little, Bruce starts to gain his respect, and this guy teaches him how to kind of hold his own in a fight, you know. And I love that. And then much later on, then when Bruce has left the monastery, we get this whole extended sequence where instead of just cutting to him, you know, walking up to the private jet, he has to beg for a loose change just to make a phone call back to Gotham. And he spends like days hiking, and he's starving in the cold and all this kind of stuff. And who does he meet but the crew member from this ship who taught him how to fight? And he's there with his mail order bride, and they're celebrating. They've just gotten married and all this. And he's the guy that gives Bruce the money to. So I love all that stuff. And there's also a very brief line in the novelization that before Bruce returns from college, he goes on this advanced race car driving course, which explains why he's such a good driver later on in the movie, which, you know, nobody really ever points that out, but like he's amazing at driving the Batmobile. How does that happen, you know? But no, I always definitely, just in the movie in and of itself, I had no problem with them simplifying the idea that he gets all the training from the League of Shadows, because it's implied that they're this otherworldly kind of, you know, the combat style they use is so advanced and so incredible that he can literally take on 600 men. You're kind of like, this is all that guy's going to need, you know, that way. So.
Yeah, no, I agree. But I think those references to the other training that Bruce had undergone, even though we don't see it, I think that went a long way. So what Ducard references, and like you said, the fact that we see Bruce taking on all of those guys in that initial prison sequence, that went a long way. I think if there had been a straight shot from him getting on the boat to walking up to those temple doors, I would have felt like, no, I want him to have had a broader range of experience and education before he gets to the League of Shadows. So clearly he had that. We just didn't necessarily see it, and I'm okay with that. And I think really drilling down on the League of Shadows, that piece of the training made sense, because then obviously this puts Bruce in the position of needing to decide whether or not he's truly going to fall in with their ways. And obviously the final test is killing that prisoner that they have there. And of course his refusal to do that. So I thought that worked. That whole training sequence and everything that Ducard is espousing, Ducard's whole line, criminals thrive on the indulgence of society's understanding. The business about using theatricality and deception and the gunpowder to create the smoke and the explosion, like all of that, just to see those pieces, right, that will become the building blocks of the Batman persona, I just thought were terrific. And continue, like when I think about the movie, like that training sequence is just absolute standout.
That was probably the first moment watching the movie as a kid where I was like, oh my God, I can't believe how good this is. It's just like there was tears in my eyes. I was like, this is exactly what I thought it was going to be. And yeah, like even when he picks up the smoke and he's throwing it, you're like, oh, this is like something out of the animated series. It's incredible. So good. Quick thing about the theatricality and the smoke and all that stuff. Man, you go back to Zorro, like all of that stuff is in Zorro as well. Like there's not so much definitely the Antonio Banderas movies as well, but there's a 1990 TV show. It's just called Zorro. And the guy in it was called Duncan Regehr, I think was the name of the actor. There's so much in that show that's very, very similar to stuff that happens in these Nolan Batman movies. Just the theatricality and the deception and the kind of big, grand, explosive sort of Batman things that he does. Definitely, like it was only kind of watching the movie this time where I was like, oh yeah, that they do all that in Zorro as well. So definitely check that out if you ever want to go down a Zorro tangent as part of this Batman show.
Right on. Now, as we all know, and we had referenced already, the twist of the movie is that Liam Neeson's character is not actually Ducard as he initially presents himself, but rather he is Ra's al Ghul. Now, while they don't spell this out, I think the reading on it from the film itself. I know the novelization is its own story, but as far as the film itself, right, is our understanding that Roz is a title that has been passed down and that Liam Neeson, so to speak, is the one who is bearing it at this point in time. But we're not in the true realm of immortality and Lazarus pits and all of that in the actual film. Yeah.
Yes.
Which for the purposes of this film, I was fine with. I don't know if more hardcore Batman fans and especially Ra's al Ghul fans had an issue with that. Arguably they did. I'll also say that when I first watched this movie at 18, I was not aware of Ducard as a comic book character. When he was introduced in the film, I'm like, okay, he's this guy. And then we get the twist. I love the way that twist plays out in this. Now, jumping back to the novelization, which you have read in full, I did intend to read. I only ended up making a little bit of a dent in it, but I started to get a good sense of the ways in which it kind of carved its own path. And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of those ways is that we get all of these diary entries from Ra's al Ghul. Yeah. So you get much more insight into Raz's perspective and past deeds. And that does more closely adhere to the traditional comic book telling of Raz. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, what I know of, it's been a while since I've read the Demon's Head, I guess, or the Demon's Quest, the original comic storyline. And I don't know if his origins really played into that. Like they go deep into the first time he used the Lazarus pits and all this business. And probably the most interesting thing about those diary entries actually is there's a moment where he is plunged into the Lazarus pit for the first time. And then when he comes out of it, the madness takes over and that kind of thing. And he is actually the person who kills his wife.
Okay.
And then one of his disciples lies to him later on and blames someone else. And he goes and gets vengeance on that guy. So this whole time we're privy to this information that, actually Liam Neeson's Ra's al Ghul is responsible for his wife's death, not this other unnamed enemy, which I thought was an interesting change. Reading the book, I was like, it's kind of neither here nor there in this film, that whether or not he's actually an immortal, Lazarus pit using supernatural creature. I think it's kind of, it doesn't really factor into it. I'm kind of fine with the fact, though, that in the main body of the film, it's kind of just implied that, as you say, it's passed down. It's just a title. His methods it's all about theatricality and deception at the end of the day anyway. Like maybe there's something supernatural going on, but maybe he really is just this guy. So I never really had a problem with it. And I think it goes back to Nolan's kind of prime directive with all these movies was, let's strip these things down to their core. Let's get rid of all the gimmicks, basically. The Joker doesn't have his hand buzzer. He doesn't have his squirting flower. He's not perma white, as Bill Raimi on Batman on Film podcast used to say. Bane doesn't have his venom. So what are these things that make these characters who they are? And I think it's really more about what Raz stands for in this film that makes him so close to the comics version. Just on the twist, by the way, the first time I saw the film, I don't know, is it just that Christian Bale's line delivery is so quick? He's like, or cheap parlor tricks to hide your true identity, Ross. Like he says it so quickly that it kind of passed me by in the first time I saw it. And my friend was telling me later on, he was like, oh yeah, and what did you make of the twist? I was like, wait, what twist? Was he not Ducard? And even in the credits, it just says Ducard, Liam Neeson. It doesn't say Ra's al Ghul. And, and then someone pointed this out to me. They literally made like a $300 Hot Toys version of the Ken Watanabe version of, decoy Ra's al Ghul. So it must have been so confusing and frustrating for like the Warner Brothers marketing team that they had to market these two characters as completely different things, But I to my point being, I don't know how much that twist matters. That kind of way?
Yes. So, yeah, I mean, I guess I don't disagree. And I get what you're saying. Yeah, Bruce Bruce does get there real fast. It's funny, for a movie that doesn't really delve into him as a detective per se, like he gets there real fast when there's this whole bit about I watched Ra's al Ghul die, and then Liam Neeson reveals himself. And then this whole business about, but is Ra's al Ghul immortal, or his means supernatural, or like you said, or cheap parlor tricks to conceal your true identity? Now, just to confirm, so in the novelization though, Raz still poses as Ducard, and you still get that reveal later. Yes, but it's just that the true Roz is immortal and has preserved himself through the Lazarus Pits in the more traditional iteration.
He literally is immortal in the novelization, yeah.
Okay.
And they really underline that with all these diary entries throughout. And I don't know, was that Denny O'Neil kind of going, no, God damn it, we will have the Lazarus Pits in my Batman novelization, or or maybe it just didn't occur to him that this was going to be this big realistic version of the story where they were going to lean away from all that stuff. That kind of way. So it's not really clear. But I don't think I don't think it takes away from the way they present it in the film at all. I think it's fine to have this version of it where no, there are Lazarus Pits, and he is literally the version of the comics where he's been dead and alive thousands of times, and he's had all these. There's this business as well that he's had all these daughters, but he's never had a son.
Right, in the book, yeah.
He sees this potential in Bruce, but he's convinced that Bruce will die just like all the other proteges he's had, and really, really interesting stuff. And it does harken back to the comics in interesting ways. But I think it's kind of neither here nor there is the best way to put it.
I agree with you. My last two things, I guess, on the twist of it. Number one is that, I think you're spot on. What is the core here? What do we need from Ra's al Ghul and this Ra's Bruce dynamic? And it is that, yes, he sees Bruce as this successor, heir, son, whatever you want to call it, someone who's going to carry on his ways. And so that contrast between what Ra's is espousing about how to deal with the criminal element in this final way, and beyond just a person to be executed, the whole plan is to raise the city of Gotham because it's beyond saving, versus the way that Bruce will ultimately pursue his ends, right? Like, that's the heart of it. So that's number one. And then the other thing is, I think, like, I'm thinking about what we assume Nolan intended. I agree. I think it was meant to be more of this title, and that I read the film when Bruce says cheap parlor tricks to conceal your true identity. I take Bruce and the film at their word in that moment as far as what was intended. However, I do think if you're really looking for some, I think there's enough ambiguity there, right? Like, it's not explicitly spelled out. Now, no, we're not shown or told about Lazarus Pits, but I think if you wanted to read it, well, maybe there's a little bit more going on with Ra's. I think you can. I think the room leaves space for that, which I liked.
I agree. Yeah, I think you could absolutely, and there's enough sort of comic booky, supernaturally type science fiction elements in the film that you know it wouldn't be a million miles away to, like, because we have the blue flower and then we have the microwave emitter. Like, there are elements that feel at home in a Batman comic that if they suddenly introduced this element of the Lazarus Pits, it wouldn't feel totally out of place. And I say the same thing about the Robert Pattinson movie. Like, if they wanted to do a thing where that globulin green stuff that he injects himself in at the end of the movie, if they wanted to say that was Venom, I'd be fine with that. I think that'd be really, really cool. But conversely, if they're saying no, it's just, you know, it's just real world medicinal adrenaline, well, that's fine too. You know, you can go either way.
Yeah, no, I'm with you wholeheartedly. Yeah, you mentioned the microwave emitter. So, you know, when we get to the climax here and Raz's ultimate plot, right, he's been working with Scarecrow, who we'll talk more about, to dump this fear toxin into the city's water supply. But it doesn't take effect unless it is aerosolized. And what will accomplish that is that not a word?
No, you're right. I'm already scratching my head at the logic of this, but we'll get back to that.
And what will accomplish this is this microwave emitter that Wayne Enterprises had developed and that the League of Shadows steals. And so they are able to activate it in the narrows and the slums of the city, so to speak, as sort of the first wave. And then they load it onto the train that Thomas Wayne had built that had been, you know, dilapidated now because Wayne Enterprises has neglected it and all of that. And the idea is that as it moves to the main hub under Wayne Tower, we're going to have this fear toxin spread throughout the city. So I came across an article, I think it was a CBR article talking about how, and it was relatively recent if I'm not mistaken, but about like essentially about the failings of Batman Begins. And they pinned, in their view, they pinned it on the villains and seemed to feel that the villains weren't as effective as they could have been, or as we've seen in other Batman films. I thought the 1-2 punch here of Ra's and Scarecrow with Carmine Falcone and this general sense of corruption in the city worked great. And I feel like beginning and ending with Ra's and giving you that twist and then having having Crane carry the ball during that middle act of the movie, I thought was a great way to do this and allowed the focus to remain on Bruce and his story. So unlike that article I came across, like I had no objections to that. I'm curious, just kind of your take on the roles of the villains and especially Scarecrow, who we haven't really talked about yet.
Yeah, not at all. I think the villains are great in this. And I really do try to take these films, on their own merits in a vacuum and not look at other stuff going on around them. But you have to remember, like, we just come out of the 4 Batman movies where they had the most colorful, crazy, comic booky villains. It was time to shift gears a bit and do something a little bit more down to earth, a bit streamlined, a bit very character driven and focused on Batman. And Ra's al Ghul is like the perfect villain for that. And by having the combination of Ra's, Scarecrow, and Carmine Falcone, you have the perfect mix of you have the grand megalomaniac master planner, but then you also have a guy who's probably not going to get a movie otherwise in Scarecrow. He's much more sort of a villain of the week kind of not street level, but like he's B tier in terms of supervillains. And he works so well in the sphere that he does in these films. It's just kind of, oh, here's the guy that Batman pummels on a Tuesday, a little bit like the Rhino in Amazing Spider-Man 2, but much better than that, yes. I think. And then you have Falcone, which I'm a big believer in. Every Batman movie needs to have a wise guy gangster. I will say, watching the movie today, and we don't need to dwell on this, but I was kind of like, yeah, Tom Wilkinson's maybe the weak link in the cast for me a bit. I think maybe they should have gone with an actual like Italian American. Like I kept thinking, man, he's doing a bad Tony Soprano accent in this. How great would it have been to actually have James Gandolfini play Falcone? That would have been amazing.
Oh God.
But he's fine, but I love his presence in this film. And like, the film is obviously taken a lot from Long Halloween and definitely Year One as well. And that whole thing of like the changing of the guard, Batman coming in and suddenly all the mobsters are gone as soon as Batman arrives because he's such this overwhelming force. And it's so perfectly embodied in that scene where, Batman comes to the docks and beats up all the guys and pulls Falcone up to his face, and we have the I'm Batman. Great stuff, So I couldn't disagree more. I think it was exactly the right time to do more scaled down villains. And I think they complement the film really well. No, they're not as colorful and iconic as the Joker or the Riddler or whoever, but I think they work just fine.
100%. I mean, I think, we needed to mix it up with the villains. This configuration here allowed the focus to remain on Bruce. I mean, if there's a complaint about The Dark Knight, for example, it's typically that Batman gets overshadowed in his own movie. So here we allowed the focus to remain on our central character here. I agree with you. Like Scarecrow arguably could carry a film, but we haven't seen that and may or may not ever see that. So to utilize him here in a really strategic way, I thought was effective. Obviously, using a villain based in fear, it ties in perfectly with these larger themes that we're talking about. So I thought it was great. And Cillian Murphy, now an Oscar winner for his role in Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer. We get to see him here in an early role. And as we all know, he had auditioned for Bruce Wayne. The screen test is out there. We got to see that. But I thought he was a great fit for Crane. And we do get that iconic line reading of the Batman. You could probably do it better justice. But yeah, like I thought all of that played beautifully. We were getting at this before about I guess, sort of how Nolan writes and uses female characters generally. So I do want to talk about Rachel Dawes here, played by Katie Holmes in this film. Of course, we know she'll be recast with Maggie Gyllenhaal for The Dark Knight. And, Rachel here provides a lot of the moral compass for Bruce. Obviously, they had been these childhood friends. Her mother was one of the housekeepers at Wayne Manor, and they played as kids. They were running and playing together. That's what led to Bruce falling into the well. And then they reconnect, all right, as young adults here. And she's this assistant district attorney. And really, a very pivotal scene there where Bruce has gone to that hearing where Joe Chill is going to be released for cooperating with the district attorney's office to testify against Falcone. And then, of course, Joe Chill is killed. And then Bruce reveals after that he was there to kill Falcone. And we get double slaps. She slaps him twice in that car. And she takes him into the Narrows, into that club, and points out where Falcone is and talks to him about what has become of the city and the dangers when the good people of the city, like his parents, do nothing. She plays a very critical role here. I guess I'm curious your take on the casting on Katie Holmes in this role, because I do feel like if there's another criticism of the film, a lot of times it revolves around that piece. So sort of Katie Holmes embodying this character as well as just the character herself. I mean, this is an original character. There's not a Rachel Dawes in the comic. So curious your take on those two.
I'll start with the last thing you said. She's not she is an original character, and this is kind of a meaningless criticism, but it does irk me a little bit where it's like, couldn't you have used somebody like just,
right?
Couldn't this have been Julie Madison? You know,
right?
Like
yes.
Who do we have to pay for Julie Madison? Bob Kane? I don't think so. You know, just make it somebody. Or Andrea Beaumont. They probably would have had to pay someone if they made it Andrea Beaumont, but couldn't it have been someone is my first complaint. That's not a major thing. I think she actually has a really interesting role in the film. She embodies the kind of the childhood that Bruce is never going to get back. I always like to think of it like as we're told repeatedly that he loves her, but I think it's just that he thinks he loves her. He loves what she represents. He doesn't actually love her. And it's just this flaw that runs, a very human, very realistic flaw that runs through the first two movies, is this idea he has of the life him and Rachel could have together. I love that. And it's one of these things that people always complain, oh, Batman would never do that. He'd never stop being Batman for a woman. No, like introduce these human, frailties that these characters have, make them three-dimensional. I love that. And I love that the version of Bruce that she is in love with is also gone. He died when his parents died, and she'll never get him back because the city will always need Batman. And by the time it doesn't, he will be so changed that he won't. It's a really complex and lovely idea for a love story. Katie Holmes, I'm kind of over and back on this. I don't think she's quite as bad as people say. I think she's actually perfectly fine in a lot of scenes. It's that James Bond problem of they've cast someone who's just a little bit too young for the kind of high-powered job she's supposed to have. And in fact, even in the story, she's too young. Like that scene you just described where she drives Bruce down to the lower part of the city or whatever. Like Bruce is supposed to be 30 in the third act of the film when he's fully Batman, and she's supposed to be the same age as Bruce. So in that case, she would have had to have been 23, which you're kind of going, this person is not 23, and they would not have this much kind of influence on the legal, matters of the DAs of no. Maybe she do. You come from a law background. Maybe
it does not track. No, I mean, so I'm with you on all of that. I think you and I went through basically the same thought process with the Rachel Dawes character, where, and like yourself, I had to check myself because I ran into the same issue of, for some reason, it does bother me that we have an original character with no basis in the comics. Although, yes, you can argue that maybe she's an amalgam of a Julie Madison and Andrea Beaumont, but there's no Rachel Dawes that exists. And especially for a Batman origin story on screen, it's like, yeah, could we not have pulled? But then I say to myself, like, does it make a difference in the end, right? Like, what's important is the role that she serves in this story. So I can get over myself on that front, but there is still the little fanboy part of me that's like, it's like a little bit of a hurdle still. But yeah, as far as the casting, for me, I think the biggest hangup is just her age. Now I checked, and yes, she was, if I'm not mistaken, I think 26-ish when they filmed this, and yes, but Reed's a lot younger, and whereas Bale was, I think, just about 30 when they were making this.
30,
and
31,
and I feel like it felt appropriate in the role. So Katie Holmes was younger, and Red is younger. And I think that's the biggest problem. And yeah, as far as the timeline of this, I think the idea is, about 8 when the parents are murdered. And then we have, I think maybe the book even lays it out a little bit more. I don't know, but like a 14-year gap. And then he comes back like 21, 22. Then he's gone for 7 years. We do get that explicitly said. And then he's turning 30. So
yeah, because I think you literally see happy 30th birthday in the film. So it's actually in the thing. We're not just pulling from the script or the novelization. You see in the film that he's 30 in the birthday party. Right.
So when he returns for the hearing, if they're both meant to be 21, 22, it's not possible that she would have made it through law school and already started this career as an ADA. So yeah, I think they could have just, maybe she could have had a different job. Maybe she could have been a reporter. Yeah. She could have been a reporter or something like that. And I think you still could have then tapped into a lot of the same ideas. So yeah, I do bump up against that a bit, but overall, I do appreciate the role that her character serves.
To say just something about her acting as well, because a lot of people knock her acting, and there's a bit where she's like, "Yeah, you better run," and then there's a couple of bits where just the line deliveries aren't great. I'm kind of going to lay the blame of Christopher Nolan for that, because I think we see time and time and again, even in his best films, he's possibly not the best actor's director. Like, I think he's so focused on the larger scale and the larger story and everything else going on. I wonder, does he take enough time to really get the best takes from his actors? And like, there's the best example of that is Christian Bale's voice in not so much this film, but definitely The Dark Knight. I think the Batman voice is a very, very common criticism. And like, if Christopher Nolan had maybe taken the time to kind of think about that a bit more, and just, I don't level that at Bale is what I'm saying. And I think similarly with Katie Holmes in this, I think maybe if they'd just taken a few more takes, maybe they could have got something a bit more naturalistic. And the nicest thing I will say about her is, every time I watch this movie, and there's that lovely scene at the end where she's telling him that, maybe when Gotham doesn't need a Batman anymore, and they have that lovely kiss. I'm like, they do have better romantic chemistry together than he has with Maggie Gyllenhaal, I think. I would make that argument that they feel, maybe she doesn't really sell the role as an assistant district attorney, but I 100% believe her as Bruce's lost love that he like desperately wants to be with. And I think they maybe have better romantic chemistry than Maggie Gyllenhaal did, who, by the way, I think she's only a year older than Katie Holmes. So it's interesting that we're complaining about her age. But
she, like, I feel like she
plays
as old.
More, yeah.
That's the thing. Yeah, I don't know if I would fully co-sign on him having more chemistry with Holmes, but I get where you're coming from. But I really do agree with. I think that for Bruce especially, but I feel like even for Rachel, I think it is more about what they've built up in their head about each other. Because I'm saying to myself, they played together as little kids. I don't know how much time they're meant to have spent together between the funeral and him coming back for that hearing. I don't get the sense that they were still running around playing together all the time. So I feel like this is very much this idealized what if that they're projecting onto each other.
And again, just to cite the novelization, there is mentions of like times that they almost saw each other when he came back on other occasions, and it's implied that they have seen each other in the interim, which I really liked. And Dennis O'Neill definitely takes time to really hammer home how disappointed Rachel is in Bruce throughout the story, and how she had high hopes for him every time he comes back and all this kind of stuff. So he really strengthens that relationship in the novel as well, I have to say.
Right on. We mentioned Lucius Fox. I love the dynamic between Bruce and Lucius here, because you think about the ways that they could have played this. I mean, they could have leaned more into humor and made it more like Bruce is really holding firm to his spelunking cover story, and they could have gotten even more outlandish with that. But I don't know that would have served Lucius very well. They could have come right out and brought Lucius into the fold, but I think that would have been a step too far. I love the way they play this, where yes, we start off with the cover story about spelunking and base jumping and all that business, but you get that very, very real moment of Lucius being like, look, like, I'm not an idiot, like, don't treat me like one, but you don't have to tell me everything. And then if I'm asked, I can honestly say, I don't know. Like, perfect, like chef's kiss. That's wonderful. The dynamic that I love between them.
100%. And just, by the way, the sheer idea of Lucius Fox providing Batman with his gadgets, like Q from James Bond, comes from this film. It's like arguably one of the most significant contributions Nolan made to the overall mythos. They do it again in Arkham Knight. They do it in the Batman cartoon, definitely. They've done it in a bunch of stuff since then, and it literally comes from this. I think the sheer idea, I remember a letters page as a kid, and this guy wrote in, and he was like, settle a bet that I have between me and my wife. You know, the whole idea of Batman and his gadgets in the Batcave and all that sort of stuff. Are we saying that Alfred and Bruce just built all that stuff, or does he buy it through dummy corporations and siphon it off Wayne Enterprises? And literally the editor who wrote back was like, no, it's just him and Alfred. They just build all the stuff. Whereas this movie is the complete opposite of that. It's like, no, he's embezzling it from the company. Lucius Fox is giving him stuff. It's just a really, really interesting change. And I love that. Whereas Lucius Fox, prior to this, my main experience of him is in the animated series where he's just this kind of clueless bureaucrat who works at Wayne Enterprises. And he's a nice guy, but like he doesn't really do anything more significant than that. So I love that. And what a coup getting Morgan Freeman to play that role as well. He really makes something of it. I did mention James Bond earlier on. That's the most significant James Bond similarity, is like he's just blatantly Q from James Bond, and I love that. And they arguably did a better version of Q than the recent James Bond movies have done, you know?
So I'm not as big a Bond guy as you, but no, I definitely see the line of comparison that you're drawing. And look, I don't know, at this point, when we talk about the grounded realism of these films, I don't know if people roll their eyes, but there's something to be said for it. And the realism in terms of the practical aspects, but even more so, like we've been talking about like showing what it would take for a person to actually do this. But then, tangibly to show like where this gear comes from, like all of these military-esque prototypes that now Bruce is able to repurpose. And the fact that they have Lucius in that role and it's not all falling on Bruce and Alfred, it makes all the sense and opens up this other dynamic. And I also, like, Alfred has plenty to do still across these films and certainly in this one. So I don't feel like it takes away, but rather opens up this other dynamic. And I mean, from that first time watching it and all these times since, it's like, I don't know, there's still this thrill that you get of seeing like, oh yeah, this cape that just kind of flows. But then when you press this button and the current goes through it, boom, all of a sudden you're flying. Yeah. And all this, like getting those real world explanations. If you're going to do it for any superhero character, it damn well better be for Batman, the one who out of all of them is theoretically possible. So I love that we actually got this accounting for where all of these things come from.
The other thing I'd say as well is, and this is a controversial change that you don't really hear people talk about as much, like Lucius Fox is definitely the genius in this. Like there's a moment where he's explaining the particulars of Scarecrow's fear toxin. And Bruce literally says, am I supposed to understand any of that?
Right.
And whereas like comic book Justice League Batman would absolutely know all that. This guy doesn't. I don't think it's him playing Bruce Wayne persona. I think he genuinely doesn't know. And I actually kind of like that change. They really democratize Batman. Like he needs help from these other experts in their field because it makes the story more interesting. He has to bounce off these other characters and develop these other relationships as opposed to just being this loner in the Batcave on his own with all these gadgets that he just builds himself, you know?
Yeah, it makes it more dynamic. And again, you go back to funny moments when he wakes up and he's been out for 2 days and he's explaining to Alfred how he was doused by this fear toxin. It was weaponized in aerosol form. And then he realizes Lucius is there. He tries to come up with this cover story and he's like, you know how it is. Like you're out at the club and people are passing around these weaponized fear toxins. Genuinely funny. And, you know, what I appreciated too is that, you know, obviously the movie doesn't dwell on the public life of Bruce Wayne, but it services that aspect of the story. Like we talked about, Alfred talking to Bruce about like, look, you've got to kind of play the part. And then he goes to the hotel with the models and they're swimming in the pool and he buys the hotel and we get that comedic moment. Certainly the bit at the birthday party where then he has to pretend to be this drunken jerk to get rid of them. But I also liked, and it's not the main piece of the movie here. It's relatively minimal, but the kind of corporate maneuvering that's going on with Alex Earl, the Rutger Hauer character who's running the board and all of that and has relegated Lucius to the basement. And then ultimately fires him because he's asking too many questions about the microwave emitter. Didn't you get the memo? And then all this business about it being really technical, about how the company is going public. And then Bruce and Lucius throw Earl's words back at him in that final scene where you find out that Bruce has actually been the one through all these various dummy corporations and trusts and whatnot, buying back the majority share in the company and installing Lucius in the main. But I just love for Bruce and for Lucius that part of the story was service. Like that little bit went a long way, I thought.
Absolutely. And like definitely a failing of the earlier Batman movies. It's kind of like, what exactly is he doing at Wayne? Is he doing a 9 to 5 in Wayne Enterprises and then being Batman afterwards? And then obviously in the Michael Keaton movies, there basically isn't a Wayne Enterprises as far as we know. So it's kind of like, Where does his I do like that explanation. And it's funny, the reason I even know what a principal stockholder even is because of the who's who portions at the back of comics. I had some back issue of a Batman annual, and it said that Bruce Wayne was the principal shareholder of Wayne Enterprises. And I remember my dad explaining to me, because my dad's an accountant, and he explained that to me, like what a principal shareholder even was. So like going into this movie, I was like, oh yeah, I understand all this, you know? I will say the only part of that really doesn't track for me is we have all this business of Alfred being conscious of Bruce needing to uphold the good name of the Wayne family. And it's a really, really important part of his character. And some great Bruce and Alfred scenes throughout the movie harken back to this, like Thomas Wayne and what he stood for and his good name, and you need to represent that. And then we've the lovely moment where he installs Lucius, and that's great. But then we have this other bit where Alfred kind of goes, oh yeah, well, Batman made the front page, but Bruce Wayne made page 8. And it's kind of played for laughs that he burnt down his house. And I feel like the scene is missing a moment where we just see Alfred's sad face of like, well, this sucks. Like the whole city is going to think you're a joke, you know? And I don't like, they kind of redeem that later on in the third movie, but they don't really hammer home the fact that everybody thinks Bruce Wayne is a big jackass at the end of this movie. And they would obviously come back to it, but like, I think we just needed to underline that a little bit of like, that part of the story is it's still a loose thread, if you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, I do get what you're saying. And yeah, that tension between Bruce and Alfred, that resonated because you see the loyalty and the love that Alfred feels for the Waynes and the responsibility he bears as this custodian of not just the manor, but of the family and the name, and tries to impress that upon Bruce. I mean, even when Bruce is talking about wanting to tear down the mansion, right? Yeah. And Alfred pushes back against that. Although then you get a nice... you do get kind of a nice flip where at the end, after it has been burned down, and Bruce's initial instinct is to rebuild it exactly as it was. And it's Alfred, right? Isn't Alfred the one who sort of floats the idea of maybe making some improvements?
Oh, I love that bit so much. That was another bit in the cinema where I was like, yes, because there's this whole push and pull with Alfred where he obviously doesn't fully approve of Bruce being Batman. But you kind of get the impression from this version of Alfred throughout the 3 movies that like, yeah, it's not great that he's doing this, but it's kind of cool though. Whatever. Michael Caine himself came up with the idea that like, the way he was playing it was that Alfred had this kind of suspect military background, and that he was this real tough, hard London geezer, and that's why Thomas Wayne kept him around, and that's why he entrusted him with his son after he died. To my knowledge, that was just literally Michael Caine making that decision himself. And that by the way, sorry, that's the other really big contribution this movie made, was that no, Alfred is actually this tough badass, and he has this military spy background. I think he was a spy definitely in some versions. I know they hinted that in the animated series, but in this he's a tough odd man from London. And pretty much every version of Alfred that isn't the mainline comics since then has been that, like to a fault, I would argue. I think we need to circle back now, almost. Like even in Absolute Batman, he's this MI6 badass. Definitely in the Andy Serkis version, in the Gotham TV show, in Batman Earth 1. They're all derivative of this Michael Caine version,
Yeah, it's funny because they have this discussion about sort of Bruce's public persona, and then we see where Bruce takes that with the models and the hotel and kind of making a fool of himself. But yeah, I don't know. That's probably not what Alfred exactly had intended. But it was interesting. Just the fact that it was addressed, I really appreciated.
Absolutely.
And I mean, it's funny. I guess we've mentioned him here and there, but we really haven't talked a lot about Gordon. In all of this. Good. And this obviously ripped right out of year one of the lone, good, honest cop in this corrupt city, and certainly the contrast and the conflict between him and Flass. And now, correct me if I'm wrong, the book goes into a lot more of his home life. Is that correct?
It touches on it. And not only that, it says that after the Waynes died, and we have that lovely scene where he puts the coat around Bruce, he goes off to Chicago after that and has a really bad experience there. And a lot of the stuff that happens in year one is implied to have happened. And then as a result of that, he has to return to Gotham with his wife in disgrace. And So all of that is said to have happened in the intervening years, which is interesting because I remember the first time I saw the film, I was a bit taken aback because he's a cop in Gotham at the start of the movie when year one opens and it's implied that he's been in Chicago for all these years. So I thought that was a cool little bit. And there's definitely mentions of Barbara and, her being left alone with the kid all the time and stuff like that. It's not something that a lot of attention is paid to, but it is mentioned, yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, certainly you talk about how this trilogy comes full circle. The moment of him putting the coat around Bruce's shoulders in the police station, right? That's the way that Bruce will share his true identity with Gordon in Dark Knight Rises. So I love it for that. And I love it just unto itself in this first film. And this line that we keep quoting about the first truth of Batman, the saving grace, he was never alone. And so having Gordon in that early critical moment was great. And then seeing this early alliance that they form.
Do you know where that comes from, by the way?
Which part exactly?
Gordon being there when the Waynes are shot. That actually originates from Batman 89. That was in the script for Batman 89. And when Pat Hingle was cast, he was cast on the understanding that he was going to have this lovely scene with, and the photo of Bruce in Batman 89, child Bruce having just seen his parents be murdered, and you see a policeman with his hand on his shoulder. That is, for all intents and purposes, that's supposed to be Jim Gordon, which I thought was, I don't know, is it just a coincidence that David Goyer happened to come up with the same idea, or was he literally plucking that from this earlier version of Batman 89? But I love that they resurrected that idea and put it in this movie.
Right on. You mentioned this before, but the voice, that was another thing that I'm struck by here is that we know as growly as the Batman voice becomes, it was, I felt much more balanced here in this one. Like clearly there's a voice that he's putting on, but not over the top.
No, I don't think so. And like there's maybe one or two lines where he's really shouting in that kind of raspy, do I look like a cop? But like it's effective. It's not embarrassing. Maybe it's a less is more thing, or I don't know what it is. And definitely, I don't know if you played the tie-in video game for PlayStation 2, but Christian Bale voices Batman throughout that, and it's great. And Michael Caine's in that, and Morgan Freeman as well. But like throughout that, you're never going to go, oh wow, his voice is so embarrassing. It really is something that I feel came to be the case in The Dark Knight. And even less so in The Dark Knight Rises. I don't think it was quite as bad in the third movie. It's really just that second one. You'll be in a pad itself. It's just, there's a couple of readings where you're just going, oof, can we do that again? Or can we fix it in the edit? Because it's just not great.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I thought it worked great here. I mean, I swear to God, swear to me line.
Swear to me.
Amazing. So I want to just go through some of our patron comments and questions. A few of them hit on things we've already talked about, so we can move kind of quickly and then we can wrap up here. But actually, on the note of Gordon, Jeff says, while it's a great movie, one thing always struck me as wrong. Jim Gordon should never be inside the Batmobile. The two work together as compelling storytelling because they offset each other. Neither is ever fully in the other's world. Having Jim use the Batmobile to destroy the train pylons is clearly over that line of demarcation for me. I did not bump up against this. How about yourself?
Not at all. No, that's like one of my favorite little crowd pleaser bits in the movie when he's sitting in the Batmobile and he misses the first shot and you see the disgust on his face, and then he hits the second one. He's like, yes, it's amazing. And then maybe the biggest kind of just smile on my face moment in the whole movie is that wonderful moment when at the very end the music is simmering up, the Batmobile cockpit opens, he stands up and he sees Batman fly by and he just gives him that little wave.
Yes.
Brilliant.
Yes.
Love it.
I agree. Yeah, no, I'm fine with him being in the Batmobile. Would I want it to be a regular occurrence? No, but in a climactic moment of crisis, I'm fine with it. I think there's also something for me, the fact that this isn't the comic book Batmobile with all of everything that accompanies it and the computer system and everything, although it does have that. But the fact that it's more of just this tank that Batman entrusts him to use, I was fine with it. This is very minor and nitpicky. Obviously, they're going for the humor, but Gordon's reaction when the seat shifts and kind of pushes him downward into position was just, I wouldn't have minded just kind of like scaling that reaction back, like just a little bit, like just, especially at that moment. But I was fine with that. Jim says, how did you like the merging of the two characters, Ra's al Ghul and Ducard? Ra's is a classic villain, while Ducard came from the iconic Blind Justice storyline and was a compelling character in his own right. Did it work for you, or would you change how that was presented? I mean, obviously we talked about that at length.
Yeah.
The only other thing I would add is that, or I already said this, the fact I didn't know Ducard was a character from the comics the first time I saw this. So there was no part of me that's like, oh, they merged two characters into one and they did either or both of them a disservice. And I think because of that, I really had no issues with it.
Again, Batman 89, Ducard was created by Sam Hamm, which is another neat little connection. The only thing I'll say on the change, because I know Zach complains about, our friend Zach Moore, it did create that trope. And I think people despise that trope now of, you have this character from the comics, but then they turn out to be another character from the comics. It's like, and it's infected every other blockbuster. It happens in Star Trek. It happens in a bunch of stuff. And it happens in James Bond. It's like, oh, can we stop doing this, guys?
And then let's see a couple more here. This too, we talked about a lot, but our pal Tyler Patrick from Krypton Report. How do you feel that Batman wasn't born that night in the alley? It wasn't a child's decision. It was the construct of an adult. I mean, like we said, I think it really tracked here. It was effective. And I think ultimately you trace Batman back to that night. So even if it takes a while for him to discover the actual means that he's going to employ, it all goes back to that moment. So like I said, the core of it is there for me.
It's far more of a complex three-dimensional journey in this, I think, than it is in the source material.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. Chase says, Batman Begins is just great. It remains on the podium with The Dark Knight and The Batman as my favorites. I've always loved the scene where Scarecrow sprays Batman with the fear toxin and lights him on fire. Bruce very nearly dies, if not for Alfred. And you can see the genuine fear on Alfred's face as he drives him home, as he hallucinates in the back seat. I enjoy moments where Batman is vulnerable because it makes evident how much strength and resolve it takes to become more than a person, to become a symbol. Absolutely, 100%.
Very well said.
And
I always wonder what that conversation must have been when he calls Alfred on the phone and he's been infected.
I know.
How did he explain that?
And then the last one here from our patrons that you might have more to say on this than I do, but Jan says, do you like the portrayal of Gotham City in this film? And do you wish I think he means aesthetically. And do you wish the two sequels had stuck with it instead of making it look like a regular city?
Yes, 100% I do. And and whenever people are like, oh, Nolan's Gotham never look, but in this film, it absolutely looks like Gotham City. And I do wish they had retained that. Especially in The Dark Knight, which I absolutely adore for a litany of reasons, but 100% the biggest thing you can level at that is it doesn't look like Gotham. It looks like Chicago. It looks like any town USA. In this, it absolutely looks like Gotham City. It's amazing. And it doesn't look gothic, but it looks dirty and grubby and slimy.
I guess overall I agree with that, but I think I'm cool. I'm cool with the depiction of the city in the various films of Nolan's. I think for the reason that, and obviously this is in keeping with Nolan's whole approach to do everything as practically as possible to capture as much in camera as possible before we resort to VFX. And that's the thing that's most important. So the fact that we are on the streets, I mean, here they filmed in London, New York, Chicago. And so I think you have an amalgam and clearly there was VFX employed for the wider cityscapes and all of that. And the Narrows, that was a set, if I'm not mistaken. Right.
So I think the Narrows was entirely Shepperton Studios in London. That's where all of Jack Gleason's scenes were. I actually met Jack Gleason. This is Joffrey from Game of Thrones. I met him on the train here in Dublin one time. And it was before Game of Thrones, but it was after Batman Begins. And I got to talk to him about Batman Begins. I was saying, geez, that was great. And it must have been amazing flying to America and all this. And he said, no, we shot all my scenes in London. So I think all that Narrow stuff, and definitely probably the bit with Flass, Do I Look Like a Cop? I think that was all in England. This is a very English and by the way, Irish movie. No, I'm not just talking about Cillian Murphy and Liam Neeson. There is a crap ton of Irish actors kind of just dotted throughout this, and it's part of the reasons why I love it so much.
Right on. Yeah, so I mean, I think like for me, the most important thing is that like we are on the street and it feels as real as possible. That to me is paramount. And then whether or not we're basically just using Chicago for Gotham or it's a bit more of an amalgam, I guess I do gravitate ultimately more to what we had here in Batman Begins, because overall it did allow Gotham to feel more like its own thing. But overall, I'm cool with it. I think the last thing, at least on my part, that we have to mention is the music, is the score, the Hans Zimmer and James Newton Howard score to this film, which is just iconic. I mean, I think now really whenever I kind of think of Batman, this is the music that's kind of like pounding in my head.
the way I like to say it's like you took everything that was great about Danny Elfman's theme and everything that was great about Shirley Walker's theme from the animated series and merged them into something. So you have that real kind of tragic kind of operatic theatricality and romance of the animated series theme, and just the dark, angry, dangerous violence of the Danny Elfman theme. And it just brings them all together in a beautiful way. The Bruce Wayne stuff is just gorgeous. I believe that was kind of more James Newton Howard than Hans Zimmer. He doesn't always get his props. Like the Thomas Wayne, the kind of do 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 do, that stuff is lovely. The love theme is great. Absolutely loved it. And then obviously the main chase sequence in the Batmobile, where you have that epic heroes theme, is just so cool. And I always say, like, with Marvel movies you stay because there's a scene at the end. With these Nolan Batman movies you stay because you want to listen to the whole score. It just sounds incredible.
Absolutely. Is there anything we haven't talked about that we would be remiss if we didn't?
Oh man, I would implore that people read that novelization. I think it's not perfect, but it's just gorgeous. I think there's such beautiful symmetry that Denny O'Neil, one of the most undersung, I think in modern terms, he's undersung Batman writers ever. That the fact that he got to write this, having had such a substantial role in creating the stories that led to this film in the first place, it's just so lovely, and it ties in with a lot of other stuff he wrote. I would also recommend reading his Nightfall novelization. It's absolutely gorgeous. I just think that this film has aged really, really well. I think the messages and meanings you can take from it. I think, it doesn't matter who we are underneath, it's what we do that defines us. That's just such a strong, noble, important message to get as a young person. And I think it stands up there with great power comes great responsibility. It's not enough to just be this nice guy. You actually have to go out into the world and do nice things. I think that's so important. And I love that they introduced all these elements that have kind of lasted and survived into the Batman mythos, so much so that people don't even really credit this movie for them. They just think that they were always there. And just the last thing on Christopher Nolan, every time I watch this, I'm like, yes, it's dark. Yes, it's character driven. Yes, it's this, that, and the other thing. It's also just a fun, entertaining summer blockbuster. And it hits every single one of those beats effortlessly. And just that kind of tension and release stuff that I love in superhero movies, where they ramp up the tension, they ramp up the kind of anxiety, and you're just like, oh my God, what's going to happen? Lois Lane is falling to her death. Superman's here to save the day. There's like 70 of those moments in this film, and they're all amazing. Like, the Loeb talking to Gordon, Gordon's like, oh, you need to send more cops. He's like, there is no one else, Gordon. And then the Batmobile just roars past. Amazing stuff, I don't think these Nolan movies get enough credit for just how entertaining and how funny and how warm they all are. And I would love more not just Batman movies. I'd love more superhero movies to be made the way these are, because I just think they're wonderful. And I would love to talk to you more about The Dark Knight Rises sometime. I completely agree. It's loaded with flaws, but it's also loaded with brilliance. And I really am quite partial to that one as well.
Beautifully said. And my goodness, even just the final scene of Batman Begins, this tease of the Joker. I mean, you get all these tremendously fun flourishes. I echo everything you said. I mean, it's rare for me in any of these podcasts I do, whether we're talking about film, TV, comics, whatever it is. It's exceedingly rare for me to come on and just gush about whatever we're talking about and heap praise upon it and not say, oh, I wish they had done this or that. So impactful, obviously for us personally, but for the character of Batman and for superhero films generally. And it does so much so well. And for me, ultimately, at the end of the day, is showing us that man beneath the cowl and the journey that he goes on, why he does what he does, and how he does what he does. Just brought so much about Batman into really, really sharp focus for me. So I always love getting to revisit the film. I was really happy to have you here along for this ride. Thank you so much. And what would you like to share with folks about All-Star Superfan?
We will be back. We've been on a little hiatus of late. I had to go off and get married, and I had a couple of other projects going on at the time. But we will be back in some shape or form very soon. And meanwhile, we have our Patreon still going strong with the Superboy rewatch podcast going on there as well. And you're coming up on an episode of that too. So check us out, All Star Superfan. We're on all the socials, and you can find us on all the good podcatchers as well.
Right on. I hope everyone will check that out. And Look, you quoted one of the most iconic lines from Batman Begins, and it is the basis for our sign-off here every episode of the podcast because it was so formative and impactful for me. So I will thank the audience for tuning in and remind them, as always, it's not who you are underneath, but what you do that defines you. This podcast is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP to save 10% on your order. That's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions. It helps support the show too. Thank you. Support the show and receive exclusive content by becoming a member at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato. Rewards include our DCU spinoff podcast, advanced listens, sponsorship opportunities, and more. My sincere thanks to all patrons. Please rate and review the podcast via your platform of choice, subscribe so that you never miss an episode, and continue the conversation by joining us on social media. Links are in the show notes. Flat Squirrel Podcast is also home to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey, a long-running weekly series mining Superman's vast mythology across time and media. Subscribe today. Lighting the Bat Signal is a Flat Squirrel production. Key art by Isaiah Simmons and theme music by Kill Me Kate.